Hey guys, welcome to this series of videos all on the Book of John. The Book of John is what's called a Gospel. It's written by a guy called John who was Jesus' disciple. And you may well know that there are 4 Gospels in the Bible. They're the first 4 books of the New Testament. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. But what is a Gospel? Well, the word Gospel means simply good news. That's what it translates to. So this is the good news of John. This is John's good news to the world. So we're going to go through it in a series of videos, and we're going to look at every single verse in the book of John. Some verses we'll cover in more depth than others, but we're going to look at every verse and what these verses mean for us today in 2020 or whenever it is that you're watching this. But to start this good news of John, we're going to start at the very end. I want to begin this video series by looking at the very last few sentences in the book of John. Because in those last few sentences, John tells us why he wrote the entire thing. The last few sentences say this: Jesus did many other miracles in the presence of his followers that are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Then by believing, you may have life through his name. Okay, so Jesus did a lot of miracles. He said a lot of things to teach people when he was here on earth. Far more things than John could possibly ever write down in one book. But John has chosen these specific things that follow to write down in his book so that we might read them and understand that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah, the Saviour, God's Holy One, promised in the Old Testament and fulfilled right here in these words in John. That is John's good news. So let's check out what he says. We'll go back to the beginning and we'll read it through. If you've got a Bible at home, feel free to find John chapter 1 and follow along. But I'll put the words up anyway so that you can read them with me and not have to look at my face the entire time. So the section we're going to look at today is chapter 1, verses 1 to 14. And I'll break it down into smaller chunks so that we can read and understand a bit at a time. So starting with verses 1 to 5. In the beginning there was the Word. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were made by him, and nothing was made without him. In him there was life, and that life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overpowered it. In the beginning. The book of John kicks off with the same words as the book of Genesis right at the start of the Bible. And that's pretty intentional. Genesis starts with, in the beginning God created, and then it goes on to give us a list of all the things God created and in what order and that kind of stuff. John starts off with, in the beginning there was the Word. And the word word has a capital letter. It is a name. And it's an interesting choice of word. I'm going to get sick of saying the word in a minute, but we'll get through it. It's an interesting choice because throughout the Bible and throughout history, it's held a lot of significance. In the Old Testament, the Word signifies God's message to his people. It symbolises his laws and his standards for living, his commands. But it's also how God created the universe. God spoke a command and the universe jumped into existence. That's how much authority is in God's commands or God's words. So we're going to get to the end of today's video and it'll be pretty clear that when John talks about the Word, he's talking about a person, Jesus. And he's telling us that this historical man, Jesus, is also God. God himself. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. So Jesus, although we know that he was born as a human to Mary in that first Christmas story, he actually existed long before that. In fact, Jesus always has existed because he is God. He's been around for eternity, and the next bit says he was even involved in creation. All things were made by him, and nothing was made without him. It goes on. In him there was life, and that life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overpowered. It's easy to see the world as a pretty dark place right now. Lots of weird stuff going on. Churches and schools are shut down. Businesses closed. People separated from their friends and their family. Not to mention the sickness itself and the toll that it's taking globally. But here in these verses we read that Jesus is a light shining in all of that darkness, and the darkness has not overpowered it. This is a message of incredible hope, and the source of that hope is Jesus. It's important to note at this point that when John was writing all this stuff down, it was after Jesus' death and resurrection. So John absolutely understands the idea of darkness. He's been through a time as Jesus' disciple, following him and learning from him and loving Jesus as one of his closest friends. And then after 3 years of that, Jesus is betrayed by one of those close friends. He's arrested, he's mocked, he's beaten, and he's executed. And for John himself, that would have been a really scary time, not knowing if the authorities that killed Jesus would be coming after his followers next. But then John also saw Jesus after he'd risen again from death. Talk about the darkness not overpowering him. Death itself couldn't hold him. But also, this idea of light versus darkness means a lot for us in our individual lives. Light illuminates things. It lets you see those things that you couldn't see in the darkness. And the Bible uses this idea of light and dark often to talk about things in our lives that we might want to hide. Our own sin and failings. And Jesus comes and shines light on those things. Not to name and shame us for our flaws, but to help us to overcome them, to help us defeat them. To help us deal with our flaws and our sin and get rid of them, and to help us become better versions of ourselves. To become more like Jesus himself. And that's a great thing. When we follow Jesus, he lights the way ahead of us so that we can see how to live. He removes the darkness of sin from our lives. And he brings hope and joy and goodness. Okay, next section. Verses 6 to 9. There was a man named John. Now, it gets a little confusing here because John here isn't the same John who wrote the book of John. This John is a different John. This is John the Baptist who, well, we'll get to him. Anyway, there was a man named John who was sent by God. He came to tell the truth about the light, so that through him all people could hear about the light and believe. John was not the light, but he came to tell people the truth about the light. The true light that gives light to all was coming into the world. Okay, so there's this guy called John the Baptist, who isn't John the disciple of Jesus, but a different John. And John the Baptist is a preacher and a teacher in a similar way to Jesus. John started his preaching and teaching thing a few months ahead of Jesus. So by the time Jesus started doing his thing, John already had a fairly good following. We'll hear more about that in the next couple of chapters. But when Jesus comes along, rather than seeing Jesus as a rival or as a threat or as competition, John the Baptist recognizes Jesus as the Messiah and says to everyone, including his own followers, "Hey, there's Jesus, the Son of God. Go follow him." In other words, John was sent by God to get people's attention and to point them towards Jesus. And that's what he did. Okay, next bit, verses 10 to 14. The Word was in the world, and the world was made by him, but the world didn't know him. He came to the world that was his own, but his own people didn't accept him. But to all who did accept him and believe in him, he gave the right to become children of God. They didn't become his children in any human way, by any human parents or human desire. They were born of God. The Word became a human and lived among us. We saw his glory, the glory that belongs to the only Son of the Father, and he was full of grace and truth. The Word was in the world. As we discussed earlier, the Word means Jesus, but specifically it means that Jesus is God. So God is in the world. God in human form is here on earth living amongst people. That's a big deal. Because it means that God doesn't just create the world and create us and then let us get on with it and watch from a distance unmoved by the stories of our lives. God chose to be here with us. He's been through life with all of its joys and its sorrows, its emotions and its experiences. So God understands us. He knows what it's like to be human. The world was made by him, but it didn't know him. Jesus, who, as we've already said, was there at creation, was involved centrally in creation, was living here on earth. but people didn't recognize him. Sure, he had some followers, some disciples, but on the whole, most people at the time rejected him. They refused to believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Remember, John is writing these words after everything is said and done, after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So he knows how the story of Jesus' life on earth ends. People in general rejected Jesus. He came to the world that was his own, but his own people didn't accept him. The Jewish people, the nation of Israel, who throughout the history of the Old Testament are God's chosen people, the nation through whom God is preparing the entire world for the Messiah, they're the ones that reject and crucify Jesus. All of the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, point towards the coming of the Messiah and describes what the Messiah will do and go through. And although Jesus fulfills all of those Old Testament prophecies, the Jewish people at the time refuse to accept that he's the one. And they get angry at the fact that he claims to be the one, and angry at the fact that a few people do start to believe him. And so they plot against him and they have him executed. But the story doesn't end with his own people, with the nation of Israel. To all those who did accept him and believe in him, and to all those who still do today, Jesus gives the right to become children of God. In other words, you, right now. If you accept Jesus, if you believe in him, you can be called a child of God. But what does that mean? What's a child of God? Well, let's think about the relationship between a parent and a child. The child belongs to their parents. A child often looks like their parents. They are moulded and shaped by and looked after by their parents. So if we are children of God, it means that we belong to God. It means that we are gradually moulded and shaped by God to be more closely resembling God. In other words, again, that darkness of our sin is removed from us, and the light and the hope that Jesus brings replaces it. It means that we are looked after by God and we have a home with God in heaven. And it's significant that John says that we have the right to become children of God. It's not like God has let us be called his children for a time, but might at some point change his mind and kick us out. He's given us the right to it. Nobody can take that away from us. God will never take it back from us. And finally, because God came to earth to be born as a human in Jesus and lived among us, we can see and know what God is like. If you want to know what God is like, his character, his values, his priorities, all we need to do is look at Jesus, which we're doing right now in this series of videos. And Jesus is full of grace and truth. Truth, I think we understand. For Jesus to be full of truth, it means that everything Jesus says and does is honest and truthful. There is no lie or deceit in him. We can see Jesus, trust him, believe in him, and through him come to know God. Grace? Grace is maybe a word that we often hear used, but sometimes lose track of what it means. Grace is about good things, love and blessings, but undeserved. It's about forgiveness. We sin and we fall short of not just God's standards, but often our own standards. How often have you got angry at yourself for messing stuff up again? And yet in the midst of all that, even though we do things that deserve punishment, God grants us mercy and forgiveness and love and fresh starts. That's what grace is. And Jesus is full of fresh starts. I could give example after example of that, but I don't need to because we'll cover them in coming videos. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've been challenged by it and you've learned something from it. If you've got any comments or questions, then leave them below in the comments section. And I'll pause the series every now and again to make another video dealing with any questions that come up with it. But for now, thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.